GM, everybody. Welcome back to your weekly FraxCheck, your weekly vibe check. I'm your host, Capital K, and I will be taking you straight to the source of truth via checking the chain. But first, make sure you tap that subscribe and like button. Show us some love. And make sure you also go to flywheeldefi.com for all Frax 101 content and many, many more. Now, guys, this week I call it what the frxETH is going on? And as the name suggests, we're going to be diving deep onto frxETH. But first, let's take a look at our flagship stablecoin, Frax. All right. And here I'm happy to report that for the month of October, we have pretty much been flat at 671.7 million in total supply. Now, at the beginning of the year, we were hovering about maybe 1.04, 1.03 billion. And it's a really obviously large fall from grace, down almost 35% on the year. However, I am happy to see us holding on to this level right here for the month of October so far. With that said, it is still a stable coin, so we got to check the peg. Here we have a peg of on the dashboard up to $1 and as low as 0.99 for the week of October for the last week. But you can't just trust a dashboard, so you got to go into the market. And here I went to 1 inch and swapped 100 million frags for USDC, which gives us an exchange rate of 0.994. Now, I don't like to see this. I think anything above 0.997 is what the bare minimum that we need to go to, because I don't want to pay normal swap fees for a stable coin, right? I don't want to pay 30 bips. I want to pay 4 bips. But regardless, we are here at 0.994. 2 weeks ago, we were at 0.998. So we are seeing the peg slip a little bit. And here, I will discuss a little bit more on why we are seeing this slip. Now, however, though, let's see what the backing is of the stablecoin. Remember, there are two separate things when it comes to a stablecoin. There's the peg, which I think is more of a liquidity side of the stablecoin, and then there's like the backing, which is literally what is going on under the hood and is it backed. Here you see that Frax's balance sheet is reported on a block by block basis. These numbers will be outdated by the time this video comes out, but you can check on these numbers yourself at facts.frax.finance. Now here we had a pretty awesome week for the balance sheet, and obviously the balance sheet has volatile assets. So you see here that we had an increase of 3.5 million in the asset column. Is about a 40 bips change. Granted, our assets are quite large. We have about 813 million in total assets. So because of that, you know, fairly large asset. 3.5 million doesn't seem like much, but it does when you take a look that our liabilities did not increase at all. Matter of fact, it decreased by like 200K, which means our equity portion or our balance is 3 plus 3.7 mil since 2 weeks ago. This is great. I don't know if you guys remember, but about 2 weeks ago, or like at the beginning or end of September, Frax had to go through a whole rebalancing of the curve pool. So we had to pull out like massive amount of liquidity, almost 200 million plus from liquidity in the curve pool to rebalance it out. And that's why like seeing the balance sheet kind of stabilizing, finding its ground, actually even increasing a bit is quite nice. Obviously, thanks to the market. Now, one thing that we need to always track is the collateral ratio. Here, I'm happy to report that we have an increase of collateral ratio by 0.7%. We are now at 92.7% collateral ratio. See, that bump, that 3.5 million bump may seem like a little, but if you add it all up, it does make a difference. And especially here, remember the bump in the asset plus the decrease in the supply is like, double good points for us. So you want to do this math at home, you go to facts.frax.finance, click on Frax page, check out the balance sheet. You take total assets minus locked liquidity, which gives you what I coin treasury assets. Then you divide that by the Frax supply, and it gives you the result of 92.7% collateral ratio. All right, so that's where we're currently at for the CR. Moving on, we have our liquidity as a service product line, which is our Frax BP. Now here, like I said earlier, I'll share with you guys why we're starting to see the peg change a bit. We have, although there's no change in TVL, we still have 124 million in TVL. The change here is in the makeup between Frax and USDC. Initially, it was sweet at like 50-50, but now it's obviously skewed towards almost like 35-65. So we definitely don't like to see that. And it's quite concerning to me that it's already imbalancing itself again. But granted, it's not anywhere near to raise any alarms. Now, on the utilization front, though, we processed 47.5 million in monthly volume. That's about 40% in the whole pool's TVL. I think that's pretty nice utilization rate, to be honest, because we saw this thing got as low as like 2%, like for the weeks, like 10% per month was like kind of where we were during the really deep bear. Now, but this is not the only liquidity pool for Frax. We have a lot more. Check it out. We actually have Frax BP, Frax3 CRV, and Frax PP, which is the USDP stablecoin. However, when you compare that to the native liquidity pool on Curve, which is the 3 pool, which is at 218 million. So if you add up Frax base pool 124 million, Frax3 CRV 10 million, then Frax PP 64 million, we have $198 million in TVL on Curve. And obviously the 3 pool still beats us by about 10%. So we're on our way, we're on our march back to see if we could flip the 3 pool once again. Remember, at one point we got up to like 3.2, 3.4x of the 3 pool's liquidity. So we were definitely sized. So I can't wait for us to get back there. But for now, we're under 1. I might bring back that graph if you guys know what I'm talking about, where we track the ratio between Frax BP and 3 pool. Looks like I got to bust it back out. Now, we have a new product line released 2 weeks ago. This is the S-Frax. I'm not sure if you guys have been following, but this is effectively your way to get T-bill returns on the blockchain. And Frax is able to do so. This is part of Frax V3. And additionally, part of Frax V3, we also have FXB, which are Frax bonds that are still to come. But for now, S-Frax is live, and you can earn 6.1% right now by just staking Frax single-sidedly. Right now, the TVL is 44.6 million. The target here is, Frax puts out 50K per epoch, which is every week, that this is going to be paid out to the individual stakers of S-Frax. And the target, like I said, is going to be changing based on how much S-Frax supply is. But the lowest yield that it would ever get to is, like, I believe Sam K said like 5%. So it would track exactly what the IORB's rate would be. So here's your way to get exposure to off-chain assets on-chain. Lastly, we check out how many holders. We have 889 holders of S-Frax. Now, this was at 220 2 weeks ago, so we did see a pretty large drop of 15% in holder count. But what's more is we initially saw a ton of people borrowed, Frax in order to stake it into S-Frax. But I guess the cost of borrowing increased, or they'd rather move out of stables and ape into, volatile assets, given where we are in the market. You see that the large portion of those users who remain actually swapped and bought Frax so that they could stake it into S-Frax. So all the leveragers are gone, right? You see lending as part of this pie chart is basically non-existent. And there's only people who bought from an aggregator or bought directly on a DEX. And the rest is the unknown. So over 80% is being bought from, over 90% or close to 90% is being actually purchased Frax to stake in here. Now, we got to move on to what this whole podcast or whole FraxCheck is about. It is frxETH, because there are a couple things I wanted to highlight here, and especially with frxETH v2 just on the horizon, given that Frax v3 is kind of halfway through its implementation, missing Frax bonds as mentioned earlier. For frxETH, we are at 281,501. That is a 2.6% increase in TVL over the last week. Now, that is not very much exciting, but what I want to get your attention over to is how about 3/4 of all of this frxETH is staked in the frxETH contract, earning that sweet native yield. The remaining percentages are split into the what I'm going to call the liquidity pool buckets and the monetary premium bucket. In the liquidity pool bucket, we have about 20%, right, hanging out in frxETH, frxETH, and frxETH. All right, it's being spread across these three pools, and we'll see a composition of that shortly. The remaining 8% is actually just hanging out in the ether. That is the monetary premium that Sam K had talked about so many times. This is just the frxETH that is just in people's wallet being used outside of the Frax ecosystem, which benefits all the other frxETH holders. Because the sfraxETH individuals getting that nice boost from those frxETH not staking, and all the frxETH liquidity pair LPers are also getting a nice boost because the frxETH, the vanilla frxETH, is not participating in any of the yields. Now, what does the composition look like? Well, actually, before that, frxETH at the end of the day is still a stable coin. So I gotta go to the market and I gotta do the swap, right, guys? I gotta hit that swap. And I changed from going to curve to now switching to 1inch because we have so many liquidity pools and we gotta tap into all of them. So I swapped 3,500 frxETH in exchange for ETH. And here is where I got a little red flag raising here. We have an exchange rate of 0.977. I think this is a pretty big flag that we need to point out. And I personally feel at 3,500, I believe, because when I ran the query, it's like the largest single holder of frxETH. And if this person were to try to exit, he would get hit with this large size. And I think here lies a problem on why we can't really grow, or there's a cap on the growth rate of frxETH, is because the liquidity just doesn't support someone with large size to kind of come in. But we have 93 million in TVL, right? So that translates to about like 6 million out of 92 million is about 6.5%. So with this 6.5%, we are causing pretty big drop in the peg. I don't like to see that. I think a large portion is due to how the pools are slightly imbalanced, as you see here on the frxETH and frxETH, frxETH. frxETH status is not bad. It's at a 60-40 split. But regardless, here is, I'm kind of concerned about this, but moving on. Here, I have good news to share, is that we are finally growing faster than all of our competitors. We are at still only 2.5% in market share. Granted, that's a very, very small amount. But what is to note is that our 30-day change is that we are at 6% relative to all our competitors. Lido growing at 0.2%, Rocket Pool at about 5%. So we are finally growing faster than our competitors. This is exactly what I want to see. Although we had nominal growth, everybody had nominal growth this week. So it is good to see that we are actually leading the pack in this sense. Moving on. Here, I want to spotlight slight discrepancy, and I'm talking about our yield comparison across the landscape. So on DeFi Llama, it shows that frxETH is only earning 3.7% APY. However, when you go to fax.frax.finance and go to the frxETH page, we are earning about 4.1% there. So, and I was like, okay, there could be possibly a validator queue issue, things are not being pulled correctly or something. But the only way for me to double check that is when I go into this chart to compare how frxETH is doing relative to rETH and stETH. And if you had staked with sfraxETH instead of rETH, you would have earned 49% more in your return. And if you had staked sfraxETH instead of stETH, you would have earned 30% more, or 31% more actually. So I'll let the number speak for itself. All of these yield translate to about a 6% APY for sfraxETH and a 5% for stETH and then a 4% for rETH. You do your own math, and I didn't cherry pick a time zone. This is year to date. So frxETH is clearly the superior product. Moving on to the final stablecoin, and this is a stablecoin that frankly no one pays attention to, but it's actually quite interesting. It is the FPI, that is the Frax Price Index. And for those first-time listeners, this is our stablecoin that is pegged to the inflation rate. Okay, and here the annual inflation index is pegged at 3.7%. FPI itself is actually above peg by 40 bips, and there's 85 million supply of FPI out there. And that 85 million supply translates to 93.1 million treasury value. And out of that, 36% is being put to work in the convex FPI Frax pair, obviously earning that sweet yield. And those yield accumulated to 3.7 million in equity. Okay, this is the balance difference between the liabilities and the assets. Said differently, if FPI were to close down tomorrow, then Frax would, or then all FPIS or VEFPIS holders will get access to that 3.7 million in excess after paying every single FPI token holder out. Really good to see that. Now we got to move on to the sub protocols that support all of these assets. Here we have Frax Lend, which is our own isolated lending pools. Here we have 233 million in TVL with 64 million borrowed. All right. And out of that, I think 80 something million is being lent out. So we have a utilization rate of 78%. Okay, guys, this is a really healthy number. I like this range. I think between high 70s, mid 80s is the utilization rate we want. So I want us to keep pegged right here. And as you see on the chart, things were pretty wild earlier in September. As the market had a huge drawdown, there were tons of liquidation, but it seems that we have found a pretty steady state here at these levels. So I want FraxLend to just PG chilling right here. Moving on, we have our other final leg of the DeFi Trinity, which is Frax Swap. Here, Frax Swap has 60.8 million in TVL, which represents a drop of 1.2% when compared to 2 weeks ago. However, over the month of October, it facilitated $47.5 million in volume. That is about 80% of the TVL. That is an 80% utilization rate for the month. Like, this is the hardest working DEX out there, in my opinion. As you saw earlier, Frax BP barely did like 40. So this is doing double the work. And the most popular pair in FraxSwap is, as you guess, FXS Frax. And here we facilitated about 11 million in trading volume for the last 7 days. If you normally we do between 11 to 15, but for the in the deep bear, guys, we did like 3 million over 7 days. It was bad. It was real bad. But I'm glad to see we're kind of back to normal levels, and we're not out of the woods yet, but we're definitely further than we were in the deep bear. Now, moving on, we go to our profitability. Here is the show me the money section of the FraxCheck. I want to start things off with the Frax Lend AMO, as that's the easiest one to understand. Basically, Frax would LP, or rather lend out Frax into into each respective isolated pools, and Frax would earn interest on the Frax being lent out. The simplest way that you could think about how Frax make money. And for the month of October, we pulled in about 135K. That is quite awesome because for the last 7 days, it had been performing greatly, earning 56,000 frax. This is the highest frax earning in the last 7 days that I've seen since I started tracking the FraxLend AMO. And here, this is what pushed us above that 100K benchmark. We normally only do like 100K in revenue, but here we did 135K for the month of October. And when I say revenue, this is really profit because there's no cost on it. Now, another area where FraxLand makes money is through liquidations. And for October, we have, unfortunately, 28.6K in liquidation fees. Sorry to see that. There was particularly one large position. Oh, I need to redo the slide. I think I added the wrong math, but it should be around this 30K, 35K mark, but I will update the slide and you guys can check it in then. But we are about 35K in liquidation fees for October in FraxLand. Moving on, we have our FPI, which also earns some revenue, right? Because that got to be put to work. And for the month of October, we're actually down small at, as you can see here, negative $200. So a baby loss for the month of October. But as you can see, we've been bleeding slowly downwards, behind this chart here ever since like August of last year, where we were pulling in a ton of fees and staking rewards. But since then, we've just been bleeding slowly. So sad to see, but that's why we have the buffer, right? That's why we have that $3.7 million as a buffer. Now, our last piece is the frxETH component. frxETH here is, as I'm calculating, has a run rate of about $1.4 million per year. How did I get this number? Is I took our daily ETH income, about 26.2 ETH a day, multiplied that by 365 days, then multiply that by 8%, which is our revenue fee share, and then divide that by 12 months to give us about 64 ETH. Multiply that by the current price, you have about 115K in monthly revenue for the month of October. So that's how I've been calculating the frxETH. Obviously, this is on a per block basis that we'll get it in. And plus, there isn't really a time for us to mark to market when we sell the frxETH, or if we do at all. So there's some accounting math that we would have to agree upon, but this is effectively the formula that you should use to think about the frxETH revenue. And it's better to think about it in terms of run rate of a year rather than it on a monthly basis. And with that, I want to bid you guys goodbye, and I will hope to see you again in the next FraxCheck. But before you go, please make sure you smash that like and subscribe button. Head over to flywheeldefi.com to check out all the contents, all the shorts, and the merch. Catch you on chain. Peace.